And then I am going to pass it on over to Alejandra to do our introductions and we'll get started.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Lauren B. Quetsch, who received her master's degree and PhD in clinical psychology from West Virginia University with a child specialization. She is a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Arkansas and works at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville as an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Science, where she conducts research and teaches. Additionally, she was recently appointed as an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics, the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, where she provides family-focused evidence-based interventions for autistic youth 1 day per week. She also serves as a parent-child interaction therapy with an agency trainer. Her research and clinical interests are with families of autistic youth disruptive or aggressive behaviors, families with intersectional marginalized identities such as autism, individuals of colors, and neurodiverse, affirming, and culturally competent mental health care. And I've seen her present at international conference, and she's great. And this presentation is really good. So we're in for a treat.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, everyone. Yes, we've got a lot of content we're going to try to cover today. So I'm going to do my best to get through some things and hopefully save some time at the end for some questions that you have. I'm going to share my screen. All right. And then we can get started. Okay, so we're going to be talking about adaptations for PCIT with autistic youth today. Just a note, these are some of the things that we're going to be talking about, but I wanted to provide sort of some images for you of some things I include in my clinical space, some things to think about. We'll talk about a lot of the ways to sort of adapt PCIT for this particular population. But yeah, there's just some quick things. We have really cool, like a Lego wall. We have some sensory break activities for kids to engage in. And, you know, sometimes fluorescent lighting can be pretty harsh for kiddos. So sometimes we cover our overhead lighting with something that's a little bit softer. So just some things to think about. And we'll talk about all of these today. So first, I'm just going to dive right in. In other presentations where I talk about autistic youth, I go into more detail and history about the terminology. So just a quick thing that I'm going to say here. Autism advocates have been pushing for largely using identity first language. So sometimes we're trained to think about person first language in mental health care. So a person with depression, for example. Autism advocates have really talked about how autism is not a separate part of their identity. They are autistic. And so that is the terminology. If you hear me speak about autistic youth today, I'm borrowing language from the autism advocates. So we're going to talk about CDI today. We're going to hop right in. I'm first going to just go through the pride skills. So you all know praise, right? And when you're doing PCIT, you're going to praise your autistic kids for the same skills that you're going to praise your non-autistic kids for, right? So sharing and thinking about, oh, you're sitting so nicely on the chair, right? Regular praises. But also, I want you to think about, in particular, the autistic youth have some particular challenges with certain aspects of interaction. So in this example, I talk about sharing how you're feeling, because sometimes autistic youth have a really hard time identifying how they're feeling, identify how others are feeling. And so being able to express that and letting them know that that really helps me as a parent know what you need. So here's just a few examples. I'll let you kind of look them over for a second. But when we think about autistic youth, some of the defining characteristics that autistic individuals typically experience are, you know, having trouble with relationships, friendships. And so thinking about how do we foster praise related to that? How do we help them recognize that we really appreciate when they've adjusted their behavior in various contexts, when they allow for more flexible and different play, when they have flexibility in general with like sharing things or trying new things. So having that routine and sameness it's really important for autistic individuals, and it can be really hard to change, but it can also get in the way of us trying to form friendships. So something that we might try to praise there. And then recognizing that sometimes our autistic kids are really driven by sensation seeking. So there's nothing wrong with loving the feeling of a texture, right? Or engaging in something as long as it's not harmful or getting in the way. So if we're eating Play-Doh, for example, we want to make sure that we replace that behavior, or we at least acknowledge when the child is not eating the Play-Doh. But instead of saying, thank you for not eating the Play-Doh, right? We are saying something like, thank you for keeping the Play-Doh in your hands. So something like that. Those are some praises to be really focused on. And additionally, for our reflection skill, recognizing that not all autistic youth are going to be fully verbal, right? And so we have to recognize the difference between our kiddos that are potentially vocalizing, making noises. Maybe not. There's sometimes we have non-speaking children. So this can impact how we hit goal criteria. So if a child says pa, maybe the parent reflects, you can reflect that vocalization right back, pa. And if the parent thinks they're trying to say puppy, they'd be like, pa, puppy. So we can reflect that vocalization, that's a reflection. And then the parent can also expand on that if they think they know what their child's trying to say. Another thing to think about for goal criteria then is if our child is not speaking a lot or is only kind of making noises, we're going to have that parent try to hit 75% of what that child is saying. So either it can be vocalizing, so pa, pa, right? And you're like, oh, and the parent can go pa, pa. But we're changing it from having to hit that 10 to more reflecting back the vast majority of what that child is saying in those 5 minutes. And if the child is non-speaking, then you can also potentially have opportunities, especially if that's after like CDI-4, where the parent can practice role playing with you, the therapist. So just showing like, this is what it sounds like. And maybe as your child's language develops a little bit more, being more thoughtful about reflecting back the words that they're saying too. Okay, so imitation then. I think a misconception previously about working with autistic youth was if they're doing certain behaviors that the parents don't understand, right? Or feel very repetitive, they were always told to ignore that previously. And I think, and some other researchers that have done this work really think that it's totally okay. So if they're kind of sitting there and playing with the wheels on the car, as some kids are prone to do, and just spinning, the parent can get down and spin that wheel too. And I think this really helps. In my clinical work, I've seen that it really helps that child feel connected to their parent. So sometimes parents think, well, I don't know what this is. Why don't you just play with the cars? I'm expecting you to play like a non-autistic child, like a neurotypical kid. And we're pretending to zoom the cars all around, or we're pretending to talk on the phone. And our autistic kids don't always want to do that. And that's totally okay. So let's connect with them where they are, right? So let's engage with whatever they're doing, as long as it's not inappropriate or harmful, right? So we're not going to imitate anything that is harmful to them or inappropriate, like if they were putting the Play-Doh in their mouth, right? And we know this. We're not going to encourage the parents to do that. And behavior descriptions, it's pretty straightforward. Just describe what they're doing, right? And so if that child again likes spinning the wheels of a Thomas the Tank Engine, you can too, right? So you're spinning the wheels of Thomas the Tank Engine. You're on the floor looking at the carpet, right? It's totally okay to describe those things, and you can imitate those things that the child's doing as well. Again, as long as it's not problematic. And then lastly, I think what's really interesting about the families that I've worked with autistic children, is that for many of the families, especially if they know their child's autistic and they've had this information for a period of time,
Is she frozen for everyone or just for me?
Yeah, she also froze for me.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
oh, okay. Thanks, Amy. Yep.
Oh,
Oh,
looks like we
looks like
lost her.
she logged off. Hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us.
Yeah.
Eye on my messages.
Mhm.
everyone,
And
sorry
she's
about
back. Great.
that.
No worries. Welcome
Sorry
back.
about that. I think my internet just cut out, which is really weird because I'm plugged in here at my work, so that doesn't usually happen.
All right. No
Here we're
worries.
back. All right. So, to reiterate, I guess from where I was talking about, I think a lot of the parents of autistic youth that I work with have sort of modified their lives to adjust to all of the treatments that they put their child in, to sort of drop their whatever they're doing at a moment's notice if their child is having a hard time at school. And so this is a common problem for our families of autistic youth where they are so focused on addressing their child's needs and teaching sometimes that they get to the point where they forget how to um, be a parent. They think every moment that they're interacting with their kid, they have to teach them something. They don't know how to tie their shoes. They need to learn how to tie their shoes. We need to practice our language. So I'm going to teach them how to say particular words, right? You have to enunciate this. They're not eating very well. I need to make sure that they are getting the certain foods, they're getting exposed to these foods, etc. They forget to how to sit with their kid and enjoy them. So that's one of the goals, I think, and one of the strengths of PCIT is let's remember that we can be a parent and we can just sit there and enjoy those moments with our kids. Engage in their favorite activities. You don't have to be always focused on what do I do next for my child, but rather how do I be with my child, right? And so I think enjoyment is in PCIT is such a lovely gift for the caregivers that I work with because they finally get a chance to just sit and be present. Okay, so there's a lot of different disruptive behaviors that can happen, whether it's in CDI or PDI. For CDI, as you think of like your neurotypical or non-autistic youth, usually we talk about annoying, obnoxious, or dangerous and destructive behaviors. We have those things as well as some sort of limited interests of our autistic youth, and we have to be thoughtful about the difference between tantrums and meltdowns. So we're just going to go over a couple of these today. Many of these are the same that you might address with your non-autistic youth. So I just thought I'd talk about some unique aspects. So first, for safety of the child, a very common issue with our autistic children is elopement. This just means running away and or self-injurious behavior. So first, when we think about elopement, a lot of our autistic kids will try to run away from their parents. And so it's a good thing to start early and often of making a rule and very like a routine of when we're walking back to the clinic space. Maybe we're holding our caregiver's hand so that we're connected. We worked with a kid this last summer who, if someone was not holding this kid's hand the entire time, he was out. So we learned the hard way. One of the people that was helping this child while the parent was in a group session He ran right out of the clinic. Thankfully, not outside of the building. He ran up the stairs. But yeah, some of our clinic staff got a lot of exercise that day because we have 3 flights of stairs. So yes, hold that child's hand is a good way to sort of prevent elopement. Another way to think of this, and it could be dependent on the policy in your clinic, but is there a way to block the door? So whether the parent is sitting in front of the door, if you're allowed to put a chair or a desk in front of the door, sometimes you're not allowed to do that because of fire code. So just double check with your clinic about what you're allowed to do. But blocking it with a parent's body or blocking it, at least like partially putting like a table in front of the door so you could still open it if you needed to, but it just kind of prevents the child from being easily able to run outside of the room if needed. And then always let the parent know if someone's going to enter the room so that they can block the exit if they need to. Or for our really little kids, is there a way that you can put a child safety doorknob on it? And this might be enough for some kids. It's too complicated to give up, right? Other kids can get right around it. So also know what the child can and cannot do dexterity wise with their fingers. Other things to think about is, can we provide some labeled praises, always recognizing when your child is doing something right and not eloping, right? So holding hands, staying next to you, etc. Definitely want to praise those kids for that. So for self-injurious behavior, sometimes we'll have autistic kids that are going to hurt themselves. And it's not necessarily to hurt. The goal is not necessarily to hurt themselves. It's really sometimes an issue with communication. So feeling like they're not being heard. If they do get frustrated, if they've learned that if I do this, I don't have to do what's been asked of me, then I'm going to continue to do this. I get the attention that I want. Sometimes there's sensory input, so I like the way it feels, or to get attention in some ways. So some quick ways to kind of problem solve this: knowing first and foremost if that child does it, so you can sort of plan ahead of time. And as much as possible, can we prevent it from happening at all? So does the child throw their body? I had a caregiver that was really worried about their child gets really upset and flings their head back. So we're like, well, can we wear a helmet? And the parent's like, no way, they're not going to wear a helmet. So we said, okay, well, as we were planning for PDI, I said, can we put something soft on the floor? So if they're throwing themselves back, it's kind of like a padded room. So sometimes folks that work with a lot of autistic youth will think about, how do I sort of cushion my space? I've got a pad on the floor. I think sometimes it helps with parents' knees were on the floor, but it also can help if a child is kind of prone to flinging themselves on the floor too. Sometimes we have kids that bite their arm or scratch themselves. So can we cut down their nails as much as possible? Can we have them wear long sleeves or heavy coats, something that will help sort of prevent those things from happening as much as possible. Other things to think about is, what's the purpose of what they're doing? So some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, we kind of have to problem solve it, right? So can we give them something that prevents them from doing that behavior? So if they are squeezing a ball, right, they might not be able to be picking at themselves. Or scratching themselves. If they're having trouble communicating, can we give them another way to effectively communicate while they're working on their language, right? So are there pictures that we can use in the room? I even hang some pictures on the wall of my space so kids can point to stuff if they're having a hard time trying to effectively communicate what they need to their parent. Is it to get out of stuff, right? So maybe they need a break. And if they need a break, or if they need to sprint around the room, how do we allow them an opportunity to stop? And knowing the difference between I'm being defiant and I feel like I just need a break because I'm too stressed out right now from this. And then if they're a lot of autistic youth have sensation seeking or use their bodies to sort of regulate the experiences they have with their sensory environment. So if they are feeling overwhelmed or they don't have a way to regulate their body, can we provide some toys that allow them to feel stimulated and not overwhelmed? So I keep some toys that are more sensory friendly in the room. So if they do need to spin their bodies, or if I have some wiggle chairs so they can sit if they're expected to sit, they can sit and wiggle, right? So they're still doing a great job of keeping their bottom on the chair. They're not being unsafe on that chair, but we're wiggling because we need to just move our bodies. If this does happen and they're harming themselves, I want you to think of it like we are providing just as much attention as needed, kind of like in PDI, right? Like we're not providing a whole lot of attention for it, but we're also not ignoring it because we're not going to let that child hurt themselves. And so you can pick them up, you can move them, we try to distract them. Are there different toys we can engage? Can we kind of body block them with certain things to prevent injury if we need to? And if they're feeling very overwhelmed by their environment, do they need like a hug? Do they need a gentle touch? Because sometimes it's not that I'm trying to be defiant. Sometimes I'm feeling incredibly overwhelmed and I don't know how to handle it. And then can we engage in fun activities and redirect with that? And then do we need a big distraction sometimes with that therapist coming into the room? Okay. If we're feeling like there's a lot of really high levels of aggression or throwing, and we're timing out the parent, we're timing out a toy, and it really doesn't feel like it's working, we might need to add something else. So I find that a lot of autistic kids are very used to when there's a lot of aggression or disruptive behaviors, they're very used to like things being taken away, and it's not always effective at getting them to increase their positive behavior. They don't always know, what do I do instead? So instead, we might have to motivate them and be very specific about what we want them to do. So making like a quick little sticker chart. This is just an example of something I came up with. You have 5 little squares, and every 5 minutes, if they're being safe with the toys or being gentle, right, then we can get a sticker. And then is there some sort of prize or reward at the end of the session if they can get those stickers over the course of the coaching session, right? So sometimes it's not about taking more things away. Sometimes we have to add or be very specific about what we want them to do, and can we reward them for doing that. And some of those kids just love putting stickers on the chart. Like that in and of itself is very rewarding for them, so they don't even need anything at the end. But I also want to be very clear that we're not trying to just motivate our children by giving them something big at the end of every session. I had a parent that I worked with recently who had a hard time getting their autistic child to get a haircut. Overwhelming for the kid. And they are very, very diligent about getting that child a haircut about every 5 weeks. And the kid hates it. So they were like, we just learned that if we tell him that if he sits through it, he gets a new pair of shoes, then he'll sit through it. And I just thought, I mean, if that's what you want, but like that's a lot of shoes that we're buying every couple of weeks, right? So we don't want to get into that situation. If there's something else that's motivating, like a couple extra minutes of playing on the iPad, or you get to even play on the iPad on the way home, something like that, that might be enough. We don't need to add extra things. Buy them something every week when they come into to therapy. Okay, so other things to think about. A lot of our autistic kids have really, really intense interests in some of their favorite things. And we are totally fine with that. They are allowed to love their favorite things. These are just some examples. Some examples from other people I've worked with, some examples of from kids that I've worked with personally. We had a kid that loved clocks. And so being creative about how we engage that child with clocks, it was a challenge, but we want those parents to connect with their child. And if their child loves that, we need the parents to love that too. They need to engage with their kid in that. And we can increase some of their flexibility over time. So if they are getting really upset, if we are doing anything but that, we will encourage flexibility over time, but we just need to build that relationship for now. And so at the very beginning of CDI, at the very least, we need to go for it. Play with those special concentrated interests. Okay. And so you can incorporate new things over time, but and we can address some of those issues later, but really let's love what the kid loves. And that really helps a lot of families, I think, early on in CDI. All right. So if we have some disruptive things that are going on, these are other examples of things that have really happened to me and the clients that we've seen. Then we're going to have to handle them in other ways. We're not going to engage with these type things, right? So we might ignore and redirect. The issue is that if we are just ignoring something and it's not motivated by parental attention, it's not necessarily going to go away. So we need to be really creative with our redirection. So if they love something, let's redirect them with that. If the child is running around the room, for example, and then if the child really loves numbers, maybe the parent begins to write numbers or count, and maybe that child then is like, oh, yes, I want to play with that. And then thinking about other ways to engage that child in effective ways. So if they really do like to run, maybe we can make a game that allows them to run and move their body that isn't as destructive as like smashing into the wall, for example. Okay, last thing that I wanted to cover here was that it's really important when working with autistic kids that we understand that there can be behaviors that look the same but have different functions and therefore should be treated differently. So one, we all know a tantrum. We know what a tantrum is. And in PCIT and standard PCIT, we know how to handle a tantrum. We're going to ignore it, right? As long as they're not hurting anybody, we are in the corner. We are describing our play. Ooh, I'm going to pick up this mouse and I'm going to make the mouse climb up this bridge. Whee, there goes the mouse. And we're returning attention as soon as that child does something positive. That only works when the behavior is motivated by the parental intention, right? So if we are feeling that that child is just being defiant, they've been told no, they don't want to do what their parents doing, right? Then we're like, okay, we feel pretty confident. That's a tantrum. We want attention. That's different than a meltdown. So autistic youth oftentimes have issues with the sensory world around them, meaning they do not process sensory information the same way that a non-autistic person does. They feel overwhelmed by a lot of the things that non-autistic people don't experience or don't realize is there. So certain lights, certain sounds, tastes, textures, the amount of times they've been asked to transition from one thing to another can all be overwhelming for them. And so if they have gotten to the point where they can't maintain control anymore and they're feeling overwhelmed by all the demands that have been placed on them, if they're feeling like their body's dysregulated, right? Ignoring is not going to work for a meltdown. It is a child's distress. They're demonstrating overwhelming distress, and their body is sort of shutting down at that point. It can't regulate anymore. So it can look the same because tantrums and meltdowns can both be yelling, crying, kind of flailing around. So we have to understand what the purpose of this is and potentially what caused it. So again, like I mentioned, tantrums, ignore, redirect, we know how to do that, right? With meltdowns, instead, though, it's not going to work if we're just ignoring them because that's not the reason that the behavior is happening. And obviously this will need to be individualized based on what that child needs. I would say talk to the caregiver, to figure out what usually works to help them calm down. Is it turning out the lights, making sensations as limited as possible? Is it a really tight hug? Sometimes autistic youth really love a good squeeze. Is it a favorite like safety item? And we might have to just figure this out over time. And sometimes you think it's one thing and maybe it's another. And so, all we're doing is our best. We're not going to get it perfect every time. That's okay. So if it's an emotional need, or it could be a physical need, and I've had kids before that'll just out of nowhere start screaming, and you're like, what in the world's going on? And the parents will reveal like, oh, well, sometimes they get really dysregulated when they're hungry or they're thirsty or they have a wet diaper. So something I say is make sure they have a snack before they come. Make sure there's you can keep a water bottle in there with the kid, and let's make sure that the child goes to the bathroom before so that, because they couldn't communicate when their diaper was wet and they just get really dysregulated. So we want the parent to assist instead of ignore, right? And we're not making it really loud and enthusiastic. Instead, we might need to approach in a calm way and sort of de-escalate that child, right? So these are just some examples of things that we've used before to help our autistic youth regulate. Okay, so again, you'll have access to all these slides. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm moving through everything at a reasonable pace to get through it all. Okay, other things to think about. A lot of our autistic youth really have a hard time transitioning between one area and one activity to another. So there's a lot of times where we ask them to transition even to get to therapy, even to get into that room, to change from parent to parent. And this can overwhelm kids pretty easily. So thinking about like, okay, they had to leave school, right? And now they had to go into the car and that broke their routine. We're not happy about that. Now we're in the car and now we have to go the car to a waiting room. And now we have to go from the waiting room to a therapy room. And now someone is talking to my mom or my dad or my grandma or grandpa or whoever it is, right? And before I get to play. And now the therapist leaves. And now, whoever's in there with me is going to play with me. Oh, and now we're switching. And now we have like that's a lot of transitions. And sometimes kids cannot handle that. So trying to be really thoughtful about, are there ways that I can reduce the amount of transitions? Can you get the caregiver to give you an update while you're walking to the therapy room? Can you check out with them while they're walking down the hallway if you have that capability? Is there a way that the child can engage in a preferred activity in the waiting room before walking back to the clinic space? Can you check in with the parent via the Bluetooth device that they're wearing while they just start playing with their kids? Like, can you do something to help reduce the amount of transitions? Some of the kids that I work with too, we only do one caregiver at a time because switching caregivers is just too overwhelming for the kids. Also, can we have a routine so it becomes the same every single time? So if they come to therapy on Tuesday, we remind those kids on Monday, remember, tomorrow's Tuesday. That means I pick you up early from school. That means, and here's the visual, I have a calendar and it says it's Tuesday, and that means we go to therapy and we see Dr. Quetsch, right? And then remember, I'm going to pick you up at this time. And so sometimes reminders, sometimes routines, and then we do the same thing when we're in the clinic every single time too. And then, like I said, so if you give too many verbal instructions for autistic youth, they may not process it. So sometimes pictures are helpful too. And here's some examples, like I mentioned, of ways to not only we thought about reducing transitions, but also warning children when there will be a transition that helps them sort of process it better. So we talk a lot with our caregivers about, they're like, oh, well, when so-and-so left the house, they just lost it. And I said, well, how much time did you let them process this information before you transitioned? And they said, oh, they just kind of like, we just said goodbye and they left. And it's like, okay, well, our autistic kiddos might need a little bit more time to transition before that. Okay, I'm still cruising right along. So other things to think about is we might have to engage them a little bit more if they have a short attention span. We might also have to reduce the amount of time that we're seeing them in CDI. So maybe not the full 50 minutes. Maybe our kids can only be coached for a shorter period of time and then we gotta get out of there, right? Okay, so now we're on to PDI. We're cruising right through here. Importantly in PDI, we know that timeout is effective when the child is being defiant or non-compliant. Same thing with ignoring, right? It only works if we absolutely know what's driving that behavior. However, what I've really found with a lot of our autistic children is that once the parents learn CDI, they don't always need timeout. It's sort of like they're connecting with their kids better, and the kids understand routine, and we teach them a little psychoeducation about their autistic child. And some parents are like, actually, we're really good. Our kid is super compliant now. We were just stressing them out so much all the time, and we didn't realize how to connect with them. And actually, we don't need this next phase of therapy. They're super compliant. So not all kids need PDI. I am a firm believer of that with our autistic youth, especially. Okay, So as we know, we can tell a social story with Mr. Bear. So we're like, Mr. Bear listens and this and that, right? And sometimes that works with our kids. We also have this wonderful visual flipbook resource. It used to be something you can buy on the PCIT website. Now you can just download it for free. So Dr. Massey and Dr. Gerard, Josh Massey and Emma Gerard came up with this, and they now have it free and available, I believe, on the PCIT website too. You can download it. And that's just a nice thing to say while you're giving those verbal instructions. Sometimes, again, that can be overwhelming for autistic youth. So just the visuals can really help them too. When we're doing commands in PDI, it's really important that we understand the comprehension of our autistic youth. So I really like to start with very simple concepts to make sure that they understand what's going on. And I also say, what do we know that the kid knows? I've been in situations where the parent says, I don't know what they know. And that's usually a sign of like, our child's comprehension might be a lot lower than what we expect for the age of that child. So before we just hop into PDI, I like to have observed what that child knows and understands. But if I feel uncertain and the parents are uncertain, it's usually a sign to me like we might have a lower comprehension kiddo. And so something like a timeout requires a lot of understanding that I did something, I chose not to do something, I am now getting a consequence for not doing the thing I was told to do. And I'm attaching this sitting in a chair or sitting on the ground or whatever we're doing to the fact that I didn't do that thing. And sometimes our kids are not at that level of understanding. So that doesn't seem fair then to do that to them. We also want to make sure that the child is doing something that they know and they understand. So again, only commands that the child knows. So maybe one or two commands at a time. If we know they understand this, we still maybe are only working on a couple things. And then we don't do those advanced commands. So I think of like, when you're really pushing those kids in the later stages of PDI and the parents like every time we walk by chocolate, that my kid always has to grab it and they never listen. And I was like, let's bring in a bar of chocolate, right? We might not do that with our kiddos that are lower comprehension because they just aren't going to understand. So other things to think about when we're delivering commands for our kids, we might have to make sure that they're actually listening. So sometimes we touch them, like positive physical touch, like a rub on the back or a hand squeeze. We want to make sure that we have their attention because an autistic child will not always make eye contact and may also be so absorbed in what they're doing, they actually don't hear it. So we don't want to punish a kid because they haven't actually heard what that parent's saying. So we want to make sure we have their attention. It doesn't require eye contact, but we just want to make sure that they've heard what's being asked of them. Also, we can gesture. So, we always do that in PCIT. We're asking, we're pointing, right? But we want to make sure you clearly see what I'm talking about. Because if I say pick up the block, right? And maybe the kid doesn't know what that block is or which specific one you want. And maybe they're getting overwhelmed because you said a blue block and there's 6 blue blocks, right? And you have to be like, this one in particular. Because now they're like, well, which one block do you want? Do you want that one, that one, that one? And now they're asking questions. And our procedure says not to answer their questions while they're doing it. So let's just be very clear, move things out of the way. We're not making it complicated, right? And then try to get very close to them on the level of the child, assuming that the parent's not going to get like whacked in the face or anything, but get really close to them. Okay. Understanding that PDI coach can be, for the first one and second one, even for some kids, can be really long. It takes our autistic kids sometimes longer to understand the routine, but once they get it, which is great. PDI works really well for those kids that understand it. And they love the routine, they love the consistency and the expectations. And we get a lot of kids that are compliant once they get it, once they fully get it. However, it can, the first and second PDIs can be really long sometimes. So if you have the capacity, not everybody has this, I totally get it. If you have the capacity, maybe try and extend that session if you can. It's like the last slot of the day and you're okay with staying an extra 30 minutes or something with that family, that might be a way to sort of accommodate that, but totally get that you can't always do that. And then understanding that there's a lot of factors that can determine the pace of PDI. So just take it one step at a time. You don't have to plow through. Sometimes PDI just takes longer for these kids. So it could take more than 5 sessions to sort of, you know, how you like gradually go up and increase those different aspects of compliance. It could take longer than that. And also thinking about how that will roll out in the house rules. We sometimes call these family rules because autistic youth can get confused by house rules and think that means they only have to do it in their physical house. So we sometimes call those family rules so that when they're around their family, we're complying, right? And we want to make sure that we're limiting it to just one thing at a time, potentially. And we want to be consistent with that. Another thing to really be thoughtful about with our autistic kids is public behavior can be really challenging. So we want to be make sure that safety, we're always enforcing safety. Where do we go? Having a list of places maybe that are gated, the child can't escape, they're not going to hurt themselves, right? This will be a good place to start practicing this. And then it can be really hard if they go to a park versus if they go to the grocery store versus they go to the mall. So we might have to do a lot of mini outings to a lot of different places before the child understands this not only applies in the house, it applies to all of these different places. It applies at school potentially too. And again, that can take a while to get kids to get used to those different places. So thinking about, we can even practice within like a clinic, we can practice at home, but how do we do like mini tests of this as we build up to more public behavior over time? Okay, sorry, I'm gonna get a sip of water again. We've got a little bit more to go. So not all of our autistic kids will be ready for timeout, like I mentioned. And because of this, we have a phase, I like to call it timeout readiness, which is just the idea that maybe it's a step before timeout. So maybe you actually get to timeout with that family over the course of therapy. Or maybe you say, this is what we're going to practice for now because this is the developmental stage of our child. But eventually you can have your own procedures that you use for managing disruptive behavior. But right now your child's not ready for it. So we have to understand what that child understands. Do they understand simple commands? Do they understand if-then conditionals? It helps the child prepare for timeout in many ways. So if we're worried that the child is too defiant or something at this point, then maybe we work on the readiness before we get them to the next phase because they're too aggressive. I had a kid, for example, that I was working with that gets so extreme and so violent. The parents were just like trying to bear hug the child to prevent them from hurting themselves or the parent or sitting on them. And I was like, this is pretty intense. And if you don't trust that child to be in a room alone and they're not going to sort of like de-escalate and regulate themselves without you essentially holding them tight, maybe we do something like a readiness before we get to this point, right? It's also being thoughtful about like, do we need to prepare the parent? Because some of them are really nervous about it. So do they feel more comfortable knowing, yes, my child can do this? Do I feel emotionally able to go through something like a timeout? So some parents are not going to be ready for that. So we use the 4-step compliance show, try again guide, which is thank you to PCIT toddlers. We really borrowed from their guidelines for this for like little kiddos. So we first do command with a gesture with a point. So that's our tell command. Our show is command with a model. I'll do it. Like, let me show you how to do it, right? Now it's your turn to do it. Do it again, right? And then I'll help you do it. And the idea is that we are not punishing the child at this point. We are just showing them how, and we are allowing them to be successful that way. So they've learned and they've demonstrated they understand what we're asking them to do. So this would be, for example, hand me the car, you point, right? And you say, good listening if they comply. Maybe you say, hand me the car, they don't listen. So we say, please hand me the car like this, right? And then we say, hand me the car, and now it's your turn, hand me the car, right? Good listening if they comply. And then finally, we do the tell command. If they don't comply, we do the show command. If they don't comply, we do the try again. And then we guide eventually. So hand me the car like this. That's how you hand me the car, right? So those are our, sorry, that was a quick, those are the steps that we use in the timeout readiness. So there's an example for you. All right, so extreme situations, I feel like you would be upset with me if I didn't cover this. So if we're having a hard time sitting in that timeout chair, then and when you are the happiest little kid in the whole world and you're playing with your caregiver and you can't sit for 5 minutes, it's gonna be, or 3 minutes, right? It's gonna be really impossible for them to be able to do that when they're really dysregulated, right? So we have to be thoughtful about like how long can this child sit in general? So you can sort of build up capacity over time. Can that kid sit for 30 seconds? And if that 30 seconds is effective, then we've done our job, right? If they're able to regulate in those 30 seconds or come back and comply after that, we don't have to do 3 minutes, especially if they can't sit for 3 minutes at a time. And then you can ask them, and then, what else was I trying to say here? That sometimes that all they need is a short period of time. I guess I said that already, but they need a short period of time, and then if they comply, then we've done what we needed to do. We can move up over time though if you feel like that's appropriate too. All right. Another idea is if you have a backup room, right? We might see that autistic youth actually find the backup room to be reinforcing. Sometimes the kids run to the backup room and then they realize, oh no, I actually don't want to be here. But for other kids, they really kind of like it in there. And so they keep running back there and they're okay with running back there. So we have to think about what to do in those situations. We have to understand if they actually need a break. And so do we need to provide that for them before we get to this point, right? If they're having really long times in that backup room or the timeout room, or if the parent can't carry them, there's some other options where we can say, are you ready to sit in the timeout chair now? So they can go to the door. And if they're not, then you can give them a longer amount of time. Then we don't have to worry about carrying them. Some kids actually get more dysregulated when they're touched. So if we recognize that, then we're not trying to touch that kid because that'll actually make it harder. Maybe we increase the amount of time, but maybe we're not doing it for more than 5 minutes plus 5 seconds, right? If that backup room gets us to help, maybe it helps us regulate, but maybe we're setting a baseline of a certain amount of time rather than just only 1 minute. But maybe we're finding that it's just we need to stop. And so we call this the big red stop button. We might use this when we have any ethical concerns, if the timeout was really, really long and that kid is just not regulating at all. If we've got some safety problems, so if there's self-injury and any of the sort of steps of the process, if there's parent safety concerns, right? If they can't manage their child anymore, they get really physically aggressive. If the parent's like, I've had enough and they're dysregulated. If there's any developmental issues where we thought the child could do it, but they just can't. I've had that before where we tried it and I was like, this kid doesn't understand what's happening. We're just time out. We're gonna stop. We're gonna do something else for now, right? Maybe we'll go back to sort of that compliance training. Sometimes it's just too long and we're like, this is enough. So in these situations, we're gonna do this is the procedure that we use. If they're in the backup room, for example, we're gonna get that parent to get them back to the timeout chair. They can guide them, they can ask them, they can carry them if they need to. But we're just gonna have them sit for 5 seconds. Right? You're sitting on the chair now, you will hand me the block. So whatever that original command was, then we're going to get that child back to the block. We're going to have a hand over hand compliance, right? And then you said, thank you for listening. Because you listen, we can keep playing. Sometimes we'll need to help them de-escalate or regulate. We're not going to have a follow-up command here, but we're going to try to help them regulate before we ask them to leave. So sometimes we just need to, okay, the process is you have to sit on this chair, but we're only going to do it for a second. We're going to go over here. All right, you're going to do this. I'm helping you comply. Good job complying. Let's just keep playing now. So they're not escaping that command, but we also are not going to keep forcing them to go through that whole process. We just might need to be done. Okay. last couple minutes, the last couple things I want to say for graduation. For autistic youth, there's been some research to suggest that the ECB might not get down to 114 that we usually expect for graduation. So in the research done by Martinez, which I'll show in another slide, they looked at our non-autistic sample for versus an autistic sample, and they saw for the intensity scale that 132 cutoff was actually more like 169 for autistic kiddos, and for the problem scale, that 15 item cutoff was actually more like 23 for the autistic sample. So the Martinez et al. Group suggested that actually instead of the entire ECB, they had more of like a 4-factor structure with the ECB, with only 29 items instead of the 36. And they said emotional reactivity, conduct problems, attention and hyperactivity, and difficulty with daily routines were sort of the main areas. And so this is just a visual for you about which items fall into each of these categories. I try to color code it so you can see it a little bit better. And so if you're curious about how that child is doing, you could actually break it down by these different categories. And so maybe you're never going to like if that child also has ADHD, maybe you're not going to like fully address attention and hyperactivity, but maybe we've done a better job of addressing those conduct problems or some of the emotional reactivity. And maybe they still struggle with some of the daily routines, but it's improved to a certain thing. So maybe you break it down, not by an overall score, but by sections, right? And as I mentioned earlier, that families might only need CDI, right? So it's okay for those families, and it's okay to just, some families might be done after that. But one of the biggest things that I do want to say is that working with autistic youth and researching autistic youth and families, there's just not a lot of interventions that include the whole family in it. So the fact that the parent gets to be part of the intervention, and not just part of it, but the primary component of it, is very unique about PCIT. And it focuses on the relationship. Every other intervention really for autistic youth is, how do we learn a new skill? How do we adapt to this environment around us? So I really do believe that PCIT is just a lovely gift for our families to be able to connect with their children, to slow down and enjoy their child, and to have a more functional and sort of in their day-to-day lives with their child. In addition to like, oh yes, of course it's a lot easier now that my child is doing okay in school and these other things, but just enjoying their kid and not having to be so stressed in every interaction that they have with them. I just really feel like it can be tough as clinicians to try to understand our autistic youth, but I think we're doing such an important service for these families to have this opportunity. So thanks, everybody. If we have time for a couple questions, I'm happy to do it. I just want to thank my graduate students here, and then this is my contact information. If anyone has any other questions or wants to visit our lab website.
Thank you. That was great. Way to pack in all the content.
Sorry about that. I was trying to push through.
Oh, it was great. It was great. And especially the end there. I really like that, thinking about the considerations and the gift really that we're giving to families who are working with their autistic children. That's
Yeah.
a really important and like moving way to sort of wrap that all together. I see there was one question in the chat from like way back at the beginning when you were talking
great.
about sort of trying to keep children in the room, the idea of like blocking the door. Someone was asking about, what about the child who leaves the room with telehealth PCIT?
That's a great question. Yeah, if they're playing in their child's room, for example, can we get the parent in front of the door, or again, something blocking it? That would be my first. It's really hard if they're trying to do it in the living room, because our autistic kids will just like, they're done and they run out of the room, right? I mean, sometimes you have parents that are okay with like transitioning to a new space, but if we can get used to them saying, our routine is that when we get on, when we're practicing our special time together, we are in this room and we're going to be in this room for, a certain amount of time. If they are if they're done after 20 minutes, maybe we need to modify our session so it's a little bit shorter. But if they're like constantly getting up and down, we might just have to be like, all right, we're going to try to get in the room. But it's honestly, it's problem solving because some of those autistic kids will climb over parents. They'll like scream and hit them and try to get out of the way. So we have to be creative sometimes about how to address that. And it's like not the same for every kid, but sometimes it's enough to just be like, this is the rule, this is the routine. I even have visual timers. I encourage visual timers to say like, I have them sometimes in my clinic space where I say, all right, when we're going to be here for 20 minutes. And so when this rings, that means that we're done. And so they can visually see how much time is left. Or they can see like these are our options for playing. But I think allowing them time can be like such a, this abstract concept. So maybe helping them see like we're only doing that for this period of time, the rule is that we stay in this room. And a lot of kids will kind of accept that and be okay with that at that point. But yeah, great question.
There's another question. It says, when trying to do full fidelity PCIT, would you say these adaptations for timeout, such as shorter time, etc., are still adhering to PCIT standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think the thing with autistic youth is that they aren't they aren't necessarily going to just get to the point where they can do the thing because that's what we expect like a neurotypical kid to do. So there's been a lot of conversations with researchers and other clinicians that have done it in this area. And it's really like, have we accomplished the goal? So the goal of PCIT is that we are increasing compliance, right? Reducing that defiance and enhancing that positive relationship. And if we've done that, even if we've modified the way that timeout looks, right? If we've accomplished that goal, we've accomplished the PCIT goal. So if you're saying like, okay, I'm in the process of trying to become a certified PCIT clinician, I wouldn't recommend like working with an autistic kid as like the first time that you're trying to go through this process. I would say that sometimes you end up working with autistic kids and you didn't even know they were autistic. But I would say the nice thing about PCIT is if you do it the way that it's intended for those kiddos that are sort of neurotypical and can handle the regular protocol, that's the best way to learn at first. These adaptations are in addition to the skill sets that you already hold. Yeah, and I think never expect like if the timeout works and the kid's not going for a full 3 minutes, but like they did it after a minute. I've had several kids that like after a minute, that's all they needed because then they start wiggling and now you're like, hey, they were really good and they actually were regulated, but now there's other things going on with their bodies that they can't control or they can't handle. It's like you don't want to punish them for that. They did what they were supposed to do. So sometimes 1 minute's enough and they go back, they comply, and they're playing again, like that's totally okay. I fully believe that. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Good. Looks like that's all the questions we have. Anybody else? Any quick questions? I have a quick one that you don't have to answer today. Maybe you can email me. Because you were mentioning that you sometimes use visual cues, and I've used visual cues with some of my autistic youth. I wonder if you have any recommendations for like a good set that we could pull from.
honestly, the thing that I've actually enjoyed, this is a great opportunity to use AI if you haven't at all. I have really enjoyed making different visual cues based on the child's like very intense interest that they have. So like I have a kid that loves Harry Potter. So every time we're doing something new, we make like a little wizard that is teaching that skill or has that visual.
Oh, cool.
And the kid is so much more engaged with that than versus if I've just created something or used like an image from scratch. And it's pretty nice. I mean, obviously it looks AI generated, but kids don't care.
Right,
They're
exactly.
excited
They
about
like
it.
it anyway.
Yeah. So I don't
That's a
I don't
great
have any
idea.
like, standard forms that I'm like, this is exactly how I use. Sometimes I just pull things off of Google Images.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do like, especially when the kids are hard to engage, I really like to incorporate the things they really like because all of a sudden they're looking at it and they're
Right.
happy about it. So that's been fun. I'm not great with AI at all, but creating those images has been a fun little adventure recently.
Good. Thank you. That's a great recommendation, a great
Yeah.
suggestion. We'll have to try it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. You're more than welcome to email me, and I think my slides will be shared, so you can look at all those things too. But yeah, feel free to ask me any questions that you've got at a different time if you need to.
Thank you so much. This was really, really good. We appreciate it.
Great,
Yeah,
I'm glad, and thank
you
you
so
for
much.
handling it as my internet knocked off. Who knows?
It
No
happens.
worries. Yeah, that was
It
great. Thank you
happens.
so much. And thanks everybody for showing up, and have a great rest of your week.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank
all
you.
right. Bye, bye,
Bye.
Amy.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.